On that particular Sunday morning, the pastor reached out and lightly touched the effigy of the Virgin Mary. In mere moments, he crumpled before the entire congregation. But what transpired afterward? The inhabitants of that sleepy hamlet would forever cherish the memory. The town of Elmrook had not experienced a packed sanctuary in years. Tucked away somewhere between the amber cornfields of Kentucky and the secluded byways of Tennessee, the ancient wooden church had become more of a historical artifact than a place of spiritual devotion. Most Sundays, its groaning doors admitted only a smattering of faithful attendees, predominantly the elderly and the reserved. Yet, on this specific Sunday morning, a palpable difference was in the air. By 8:30 in the morning, the gravel parking lot was nearly teeming with vehicles. Pickup trucks, family carriers, and even an old ochre school bus, unused for years, were present. A young woman in her early 30s alighted, cradling a toddler in one arm and a well-worn Bible in the other. A teenager, earbuds nestled in his pocket, ambled in slowly, following his grandmother. Across the thoroughfare, an elderly gentleman adjusted his veteran's cap and murmured, "I haven't witnessed this place this full since '93. Within the sacred walls, the atmosphere was thick with an unspoken presence. Candles flickered despite the closed windows. The familiar aroma of aged oak pews and dust from hymnals mingled with a faint floral fragrance, though no one had brought blossoms. Pastor James Carter stood behind the pulpit, his hands steady, yet his heart pounded furiously. A stirring was occurring, and he felt it in his chest like a rhythmic thrumming just beneath the surface. He had been preparing for this moment, though the reason remained elusive. The preceding week, he had meticulously restored an old statue of the Virgin Mary, discovered concealed beneath sheeting and boxes in the sacristy's depths, a forgotten relic from bygone generations. He had positioned it near the pulpit, adorned it with white candles and midnight blue drapery, and then prayed beside it each night. Now it stood there, dignified and motionless at the front of the church. A simple statue, indeed, yet the congregants regarded it with more than just plaster and pigment. Not anymore. They gazed as if it might stir, respire, or articulate. Even the children, typically restless, remained unnaturally still. The choir had not convened for practice that week. No weekly bulletin had been disseminated, and yet they had journeyed from afar, from periods of silence, from years of skepticism, and truly, no one knew the impetus. Pastor Carter commenced the service with his customary greeting, but his voice betrayed a slight waver. His gaze repeatedly drifted to the statue, as did everyone else's. The space felt charged, akin to the atmosphere preceding a tempest, and then it happened. As the choir concluded the second stanza of "Come, Thou Fount of Every Blessing," the pastor advanced toward the image. His intention was modest, merely to reposition the communion chalice slightly, creating more room. However, as his hand brushed the base of the statue, a soft exhalation of surprise rippled from the front row. The pastor froze, his knees buckled, and in the span of a single breath, he collapsed, his form gently folding onto the polished wooden floor. A profound silence descended upon the assembly like a shroud. A woman in the second row emitted a subdued cry. Someone whispered, "Is he breathing?" Children nestled closer to their mothers. A man near the rear began to rise but halted, rendered immobile by an unnameable force. And at the epicenter of it all, the statue remained precisely as it was, unmoving, yet undeniably present. Little did anyone realize then that what they had just witnessed was not the conclusion of a sermon. It marked the genesis of something far more profound, something sacred, something that would irrevocably alter everything. There was a time when the bells of Elmrook chimed with the resonance of mirth. Children frolicked barefoot on the church grounds, their Sunday attire rumpled from their games. The sanctuary, once vibrant with voices and melodies, was bathed in the ethereal glow of stained glass sunlight and the quiet strength of conviction that required no utterance. It simply existed. Every pew was occupied. Mothers softly hummed to soothe their restless little ones. Elders nodded during sermons, not from disinterest, but from accord. There were matrimonial ceremonies, baptisms, shared meals, and prayer gatherings that lingered long after the final pronouncement. People did not merely attend church, they were integral to it. But seasons shifted subtly. Initially, the Smith family relocated to Nashville following the factory's closure. Then, the Johnsons departed when their eldest was accepted into a university in the Northern Territories. The Henderson brothers ceased attending Sunday school. Football practice had been rescheduled to Sunday mornings, and before long, the quietude amplified. Pastor James Carter first perceived it in the reverberations. His voice echoed off the wooden beams more than it once had. Fewer bulletin inserts required printing. Communion wafers remained untouched. The choir dwindled from a spirited ensemble to a scattered trio, singing slightly off-key but refusing to surrender. Week after week, the congregation thinned like autumnal foliage, shedding its leaves one by one. On some Sundays, only 3 individuals appeared. Mrs. Helen, seated in the foremost pew, her floral dress and delicate hands clutching a rosary. Frank, an old war veteran who never joined in song but never missed a service. And a teenage girl occupying a seat at the back, never uttering a sound. James continued to craft his sermons with meticulous care, as if addressing a multitude. Yet, the words began to lose their import in his own perception. They drifted toward the rafters and returned unacknowledged. During the winter months, the heating system frequently malfunctioned. He would deliver his messages while wearing gloves and a scarf, his fingers stiff, his spirit even more so. At times, he questioned whether anyone even noted when he lit the altar candles, or if the divine presence still lingered at all. Once, during a particularly frigid Tuesday morning service, the church was completely deserted. Neither Helen nor Frank, nor the reticent teenager were present. James stood behind the pulpit, gazing at the rows of vacant pews, and whispered, "Is this the essence of faithfulness when there is no one to witness?" Nevertheless, even then, he persevered. He maintained the building, swept the floors, mended the roof after inclement weather, kept the candles trimmed and the hymn books organized. Every Friday evening, he placed fresh floral arrangements beside the wooden cross on the altar. Most weeks, these flowers withered unnoticed. The town, too, reflected this decline. The grocery establishment transformed into a pawn shop. The dilapidated bleachers of the old high school collapsed and were never reinstated. A bar supplanted the bookstore, and when it rained, the downpour seemed to last longer. The church bell, once a symbol of communal gathering, became a sound the town had forgotten how to discern. James harbored no bitterness, only weariness, no lack of faith, merely a fading hope. He prayed not for extraordinary interventions, but for significance, not for crowds, but for clarity. "Lord," he once implored in the darkness, "if the flock has dispersed, do I remain a shepherd?" No voice responded. No sign materialized, only an enveloping silence. Yet it was within that silence that something sacred was poised to emerge, something he could not yet perceive, something the residents of Elmrook were utterly unprepared for, a spiritual resurgence. Not through promotional efforts, nor through music, but through sheer compassion, and it would commence where most narratives conclude, at the nadir of conviction, at the brink of surrender, amidst dust and doubt, and the quiet ache of a man still tending to candles in an empty sanctuary. It was a Tuesday, the sort that passes without notice. The skies were overcast, and a fine drizzle tapped rhythmically on the church's tin roof like a gentle morning caress. The town of Elmrook remained subdued. Main Street lay deserted, save for a solitary newspaper caught by the wind, tumbling aimlessly along the sidewalk as if it too had lost its direction. Inside the church, the sanctuary felt unusually frigid. A draught whispered through the gaps in the ancient stained glass windows, and the altar candles struggled to maintain their flame. No one appeared for the morning prayer, not even Mrs. Helen. Pastor Carter stood behind the pulpit regardless. He offered no sermon. He sang no hymns. He simply stood, his gaze fixed on the wooden cross above the altar, his hands clasped, not in confidence, but in resigned surrender. When the silence became overwhelmingly profound, he descended from the altar, walked with measured steps to the front pew, and sat. The aged wood creaked beneath his weight. Outside, the rain intensified. Its sound upon the roof was a consistent, almost liturgical rhythm. Then he uttered a prayer that stemmed not from routine, but from profound heartache. God, if you are still present, if you are still listening, reveal yourself to me. Not with grand displays, nor with celestial fire. Simply show me that you have not abandoned hope, for I am weary, and I do not know how to sustain this endeavor if I am the sole remaining devotee. He harbored no expectation of a response. The lights flickered. The sanctuary remained still, but an inner prompting, a subtle agitation, prevented him from departing. His feet felt rooted, drawing him not towards the exit, but towards the rear hallway, to the door of the old sacristy. It had remained unopened for years. The key turned with a protesting creak in the lock. A cloud of dust billowed forth the instant the hinges yielded. What greeted him was a forgotten repository of artifacts. Frayed choir vestments, water-damaged hymnals, fractured candle holders, and tucked away near the rear, beneath a faded blue cloth and a half-dozen cardboard containers, was something obscured by cobwebs. He paused. That same unarticulated, unprovoked feeling urged him onward. Moving the boxes felt akin to disturbing spectral presences, but beneath them lay a small, delicate statue, swathed in lace and time. As he freed it, dust motes swirled like ashes in the air. It was an effigy of the Virgin Mary, standing approximately 2 feet tall. The plaster was cracked. Her visage was smudged with grime. The paint on her robes was chipped. One hand remained intact, the other fractured at the wrist. Her eyes, though faded, gazed heavenward, her heart exposed, pierced by 7 rust-colored swords. Pastor Carter stood transfixed. The room fell silent once more, but it was a silence that held attentive anticipation. He slowly lowered himself onto a storage bench, the statue resting in his lap. Rain tapped against the windows behind him like a soft, approving applause. For an extended period, he simply gazed upon her, not with reverence, but with a sense of recognition. This was not merely a forgotten statue. It was a mirror. She was worn, so was he. She had been buried beneath layers of neglect. So had his spirit, and in that stillness, something broke. Not the statue, but his silence. His voice trembled as he spoke. "You have been here all along, haven't you?" There was no celestial thunder, no reply from the heavens. Only the undeniable warmth of mutual recognition between a weary shepherd and a mother who had been left waiting in the shadows. That evening, he did not return the statue to its resting place. He carried her with both hands, like a precious ember, and brought her into the parish house kitchen. He gently cleaned her with warm water, a toothbrush, and a cloth typically used for polishing communion vessels. Gradually, her features re-emerged. Her eyes, her sorrow, her innate grace. By the time the sky outside the window turned black, she appeared not new, but known. He placed her on the bedside table that night, lit a small candle, and slept with a tranquility he had not experienced in years. Beyond the house, the town remained quiet. The rain had ceased, but within that modest dwelling, something sacred had begun to stir. Not in the firmament, nor through fire, but within dust, and within a man who dared to offer a prayer once more. The following morning, sunlight cascaded through the kitchen window like liquid gold. It bathed the small plaster effigy resting beside the pastor's bed. Her painted eyes softly caught the light, as if she had been anticipating the dawn. Outside, the frost had yet to melt. The town remained cold, still slumbering. But within the parsonage, a subtle transformation had occurred. Pastor Carter spoke little that morning. He did not review his sermon. He did not check his electronic mail. Instead, he sat at the kitchen table with a roll of sapphire velvet fabric, a collection of white silk blossoms, and a plain wooden pedestal retrieved from storage. For hours, he labored in silence. No choir provided accompaniment. No fanfare announced his task. It was simply him and the image he had discovered. By mid-afternoon, he returned to the sanctuary. The pews remained vacant, the air still heavy with the scent of time. Yet, a sense of purpose guided his every movement. He placed the pedestal not behind the altar, but adjacent to it, close enough to be observed, yet distant enough to convey a sense of reverence. Carefully, he unfurled the dark blue cloth, resembling a celestial canvas beneath starlight. Then came the flowers. Nothing ostentatious, merely silk roses, as white as newly fallen snow. Finally, he positioned the statue. Her feet bore chips. Her countenance still showed signs of wear in places, but these imperfections mattered little. She was whole in a manner far exceeding her outward appearance. He lit 2 candles, one on each side. Their flames wavered, as if acknowledging the significance of her return. Then he knelt. No words were spoken, no requests made, no plans formulated. Only presence. From several rows back, Mrs. Helen observed in silent contemplation. She had arrived early, earlier than her customary time. Something had compelled her to do so. She uttered no word, posed no questions. She simply removed her knitted gloves, retrieved a rosary from her handbag, and commenced her prayers. By sunset, 3 additional parishioners had made their way to the church. Not through invitation, not by means of a bulletin, but simply because an inner feeling prompted them. Something was indeed occurring. That evening, the church did not feel like a mere structure. It felt like a collective breath held in anticipation, a hushed prelude to the returning tide. Later that night, Pastor Carter scribbled a simple message on a piece of parchment and affixed it to the community bulletin board situated outside the church's main entrance. "She is here. The doors are open. Come if you seek solace." He neither signed it nor dated it. He simply left the lights illuminated. No one yet grasped the significance of this moment. But it had transcended the mere presence of a statue. It represented an invitation. It evoked remembrance. It embodied compassion. The Virgin had not returned to adorn the altar. She had returned to summon her flock home, not with dramatic pronouncements, nor with public spectacles, but with a quiet dignity, akin to a mother standing at the threshold of a long-abandoned dwelling, illuminating a candle in the window and waiting with unwavering acceptance. The subsequent morning, a single daisy was placed at the statue's base. No accompanying note, no identifying name, merely the nascent stage of something new. Sunday arrived as any other. The sky was heavy with clouds, and the early morning mist coiled between fence posts like a clandestine secret awaiting revelation. In most households across Elmrook, life was just beginning to stir. The aroma of brewing coffee filled the air, flannel shirts were drawn from wardrobes, and children rubbed the sleep from their eyes. However, at the modest church on Pine Hollow Road, something extraordinary was unfolding. The first to arrive, as was her custom, was Mrs. Helen. Her cane tapped a soft rhythm against the stone steps as she entered the sanctuary. But upon her gaze falling upon the statue, now positioned beside the altar, framed by blue fabric and encircled by freshly lit candles, she paused. Not out of astonishment nor apprehension, but as if recognizing someone unseen for many years. Following her, an elderly gentleman who had not set foot in the church since the passing of his wife 3 winters prior stepped inside. Then a family of 4 arrived, their 2 young sons tugging at their father's sleeves. Next came a teenage girl clad in dark attire, her eyes downcast, her earbuds removed. No one had intended to return that day, yet here they were. By 9:30, half of the pews were occupied. By 9:50, individuals were standing along the walls. No one uttered the word miracle. No one even referenced the statue. But the entire space vibrated with a quiet reverence, the sort that emanates when souls converge for reasons they cannot articulate. Pastor Carter stood at the rear of the sanctuary, taken aback, not by the sheer numbers, but by the profound sense of presence. He had issued no invitation. He had publicized nothing. He had merely lit 2 candles and offered a heartfelt prayer. And somehow they had answered the unspoken summons. The organ remained silent. The choir had not rehearsed, but there was no need for musical accompaniment. The silence itself was imbued with sanctity. At precisely 10 o'clock, the pastor stepped behind the pulpit. He cleared his throat. "Good morning," he stated. Dozens of faces turned toward him, but their gazes were not fixed upon him. They were subtly drawn to the left, towards the effigy of the Virgin Mary, standing serenely beside the altar, her heart exposed, her eyes lifted. He delivered the scriptural readings. No one shifted in the pews. No one consulted a watch or a mobile device. The children remained still. The elderly gentleman did not doze. It was as if the very atmosphere had paused to listen intently. Midway through his discourse, Pastor Carter cast a glance toward the statue. Something within him stirred, an impulse, faint yet resolute. He did not voice it aloud, but he walked with deliberate slowness toward the base of the pedestal, as if guided not by personal volition, but by a higher calling. He had no intention of touching it, merely of acknowledging its presence. However, as his hand brushed the edge of the wooden base, a subtle warmth traveled up his fingers. Not heat, not pain, but something akin to vitality, like clasping the hand of a beloved individual who has been silent for a prolonged period. He froze. He did not weep. He did not tremble. But he knew she was present. The statue had not altered. It had not moved, and yet every soul in the room perceived the subtle shift. One woman covered her mouth. A man lowered his head and whispered a name inaudible to others. The teenage girl in the 3rd row blinked back tears. Even the candles seemed to burn with a steadier, more consistent flame. Pastor Carter continued the service, his voice now imbued with a softer tone. The sacred bread and wine were distributed. The prayers were spoken, and then he did something he had not undertaken in years. He requested that the congregation remain seated for a brief moment. "If you feel inclined," he proposed, "please linger here with her in quiet contemplation. Allow her to speak, if only to your heart." Not a single person departed, not one. They remained seated on the wooden benches, some kneeling on tired knees, others immersed in hushed awe. Some with tears streaming, others with faint smiles, but all were truly present, and in that collective silence, something awakened. Not with a clamor, not with dramatic flourish, but with a holy stillness, the kind of presence that does not shout or radiate brilliantly. It whispers, it patiently waits, it returns. And on that morning, the people of Elmrook did not witness a miracle. They became an integral part of one. The following Sunday, the church filled even earlier. Word had circulated, not through printed flyers or formal announcements, but through quiet exchanges. The sort of whispers that traverse dinner tables, hospital rooms, and corner store counters. Not discussions of extraordinary events or apparitions, but rather of a pervasive feeling, a distinct sense that something vital had returned to Elmrook. Something sacred. By 9:15, not a single pew remained unoccupied. People stood along the back wall, leaned against pillars, and sat on the floor with their children settled in their laps. Some brought floral tributes, while others carried nothing but their quietude. Pastor Carter entered the sanctuary through a side entrance. He paused upon observing the assembly, not out of pride, but from sheer astonishment. At the front, the effigy of the Virgin Mary stood bathed in the soft glow of candlelight and roses. Notes and rosaries now formed a gentle perimeter around her base, like humble offerings. The pastor's sermon had been prepared, a thoughtful reflection on healing drawn from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 5. But something within him, unseen and unnameable, felt distinctly different. He delivered the Gospel passage. He commenced his homily. He read 2 sentences, and then the words failed him. His voice caught in his throat. His hands trembled slightly. His eyes shifted from the written page to the faces of the congregation. To the woman clutching a photograph of her son who had gone missing. To the man who had abstained from communion for 15 years. To the small girl in a red dress diligently sketching hearts on the border of the church bulletin. And then, to her, the statue. The moment extended, not with awkwardness, but with profound reverence. A hush descended like morning dew. He stepped away from the pulpit, moved not by conscious decision, but by a deeper, more potent force. He walked toward the statue with slow, silent steps and placed a hand upon its base, precisely as he had done the preceding week. But this time, something extraordinary occurred. It began as a gentle warmth, then radiated as light. Then, the very floor beneath him seemed to subtly shift, not with violence, but like ripples of water emanating from a deep, hidden source. His knees buckled. Exclamations of surprise echoed throughout the sanctuary. A woman stood upright. Someone extended a hand forward, but he was already succumbing, falling softly, slowly onto the cool marble floor. He did not lose consciousness. He remained acutely aware of the cold beneath his cheek, of the soft murmur of the crowd, of the flickering candlelight, and of a peace that flooded his being so completely that each breath felt like a prayer. Then it arrived, not perceived through his eyes, but felt through his very soul, a boundless, golden expanse, swaying like wheat in the wind, a sky whiter than any he had ever known, a silence that did not suffocate, but rather sang. And within that vast expanse, a woman. She uttered no words. She did not shimmer with radiance. She was adorned in hues of blue and white, as if the sky and the clouds had chosen to embrace her form. Her steps did not disturb the earth. Her hands remained gently at her sides. Her profound gaze conveyed a wisdom beyond articulation. She moved towards him, not to mend or to dictate, but simply to perceive. And perceive she did, witnessing every facet of his being. His profound solitude, his gnawing uncertainties, his solitary supplications within deserted sanctuaries, and his deep-seated dread that he might have disappointed everyone. She observed, and in that observation she loved him unconditionally. Upon reaching him, she raised a hand, not for physical contact, but to gesture behind him. In that instant, they materialized. His community. The woman holding a photograph, the man with hands that trembled, the young girl in her crimson dress, every soul present in the sacred space, their faces uplifted, radiant, transformed. Though she uttered no sound, her gaze conveyed a clear message. They are your purpose. Even in your stumbles, fall with them. Then she vanished like morning mist. His eyelids fluttered open. He remained on the sanctuary floor, enveloped by a hushed stillness. Yet, something within him had fundamentally altered. A tranquility had settled, not one of apathy, but of profound grounding. 2 young men hastened to assist him into a sitting position. A voice, barely audible, inquired, "Pastor, are you all right?" He glanced at the effigy, then at the assembled congregation, and responded softly, "Never better." There was no burst of applause, no resonant music, no immediate explanation, only an unbroken quietude, sacred, unshakable, shared. That morning, Elmbrook did not merely witness a supernatural event. It experienced a collective transformation. They departed the church in a collective silence, a quietude born not of bewilderment, fear, or doubt, but of a profound realization that words felt utterly inadequate. Children held tighter to their parents' hands. Elderly individuals gripped their walking aids with diminished trepidation. A gentleman who had not set foot in a place of worship in 2 decades stood at the rear. His eyes filled with an emotion he was not yet ready to identify. No one hurried to their vehicles. No one consulted their mobile devices. Some simply resumed their seats after the concluding hymn, as if afraid that any abrupt movement might disrupt the nascent peace. That evening, illumination persisted in homes that typically extinguished their lights by 8 o'clock. Kitchen tables resonated with a more subdued atmosphere. Prayer re-emerged, not as a rote observance, but as a heartfelt response. By Tuesday, a subtle alteration began to permeate the town itself. The corner cafe, usually a hub of boisterous news broadcasts, maintained a hushed volume. Conversations were conducted in hushed tones, not of gossip, but of shared experiences. A patron at table 4 mentioned experiencing peaceful sleep for the first time in 3 years, a tranquility that began on Sunday night. A teenage boy entered school wearing a rosary around his wrist. His companions did not mock him. One inquired about where such an item could be acquired. At the retirement community on the town's periphery, a volunteer presented a printed image of the statue to a resident afflicted with Alzheimer's. After a prolonged contemplation of the photograph, she softly spoke her husband's name for the first time in many months. None of these individual occurrences garnered public attention, yet a fundamental shift was underway. People began frequenting the church throughout the day. Not solely the devout or the merely curious, but those burdened by sorrow, the overlooked and the seekers of meaning. A young mother who had recently mourned the loss of her child remained seated on the back pew for hours, enveloped in silent contemplation. A long-haul truck driver, passing through, noticed the open sanctuary doors and spontaneously knelt without any discernible reason. The sacred space evolved beyond a mere edifice. It became a sanctuary. The statue remained in its designated location, unadorned by artificial illumination or sound effects, yet consistently surrounded by flickering candles, heartfelt letters, shed tears, and unspoken aspirations. Mrs. Helen, a steadfast attendee, began visiting not only on Sundays but every morning, bringing small containers of water and refreshing the floral arrangements near the altar, whispering endearments to the maternal figure that she had previously hesitated to voice aloud. One afternoon, a contingent of high school students arrived unexpectedly, requesting permission to simply sit for a time. No one directed their path, nor provided instruction. They arrived, settled, prayed, and departed, each touched by an unseen influence. There was no formal organization, no pronouncements or slogans, merely a subtle, consistent, and profound movement, akin to a subterranean river finally breaking through the frozen earth. Pastor Carter never publicly disclosed the details of his personal collapse. However, his sermons grew more concise, his tone more gentle, his gestures more tender, and a discernible expression in his eyes communicated a truth far more effectively than any words could. He had witnessed something extraordinary, and so too had they. Individuals no longer stated, "I am heading to church." Instead, they would say, "I am going to sit with her." And universally, the implication was understood. By the conclusion of that week, the sanctuary doors were no longer secured with locks. The interior lights remained illuminated throughout the night, and even the accumulated dust seemed to dissipate from the floor. This was attributable to the constant presence of individuals, present not in pursuit of overt miracles, but of solace, not seeking definitive answers, but a comforting presence. And within that presence, Elmbrook rediscovered its lost essence, its very soul, and began to resonate with a renewed spirit. The resurgence commenced subtly, mirroring the initial quietude of Elmbrook. A solitary Facebook post, featuring a slightly blurred image and devoid of any caption, was shared by a woman visiting her sister. The photograph was simple: a statue, several lit candles, and a handwritten note at its base that read, "She is present. Come if you require respite." No one anticipated its impact. However, by Friday, that post had been disseminated over 10,000 times. A local podcast briefly mentioned an unusual occurrence at a place of worship in a town almost imperceptible on any map. A nurse from a hospital situated an hour away recounted a dream where a figure clad in blue instructed her to come home. Subsequently, they began to arrive, not in large groups or via organized transport, but individually, like dedicated pilgrims. A gentleman from Ohio who had recently committed his wife to rest. A young girl from Atlanta whose private journal was filled with unspoken questions. A veteran from Arkansas who had not entered a church since the cessation of hostilities. A mother from Missouri whose son had fallen silent following a traumatic experience. They were unacquainted with one another, yet a shared connection transcended their individual journeys. What drew them was not dogma or theatrical display, but a profound silence that offered answers without utterance. By Sunday, the gravel parking area adjacent to the church was filled beyond its capacity. Vehicles lined the highway shoulders. Portable seating arrangements appeared outside the open portals. Volunteers positioned loudspeakers to broadcast sound from the windows. No one expressed dissatisfaction. No one inquired about leadership. They simply congregated. Pastor Carter stood at the altar, observing the multitude of unfamiliar faces. Yet they were not truly strangers, not in this setting, not at this moment. His sermon was not lengthier, but more straightforward, focusing on compassion, the weariness of the journey, and the solace of open doors, emphasizing that sometimes mere prostration is sufficient. There was no applause. They simply absorbed the message and remained. Following the benediction, a reluctance to depart pervaded the assembly. Individuals occupied the grassy areas, some weeping, some offering gentle laughter, and others simply closing their eyes, allowing the breeze to flow over them like a whispered prayer. Within the church, the statue remained, ever humble, untouched. Yet everyone who passed by it felt an undeniable sensation, a warmth, a recollection, a maternal embrace. An increasing volume of correspondence accumulated at its base. Hand-written notes, wedding bands, photographs, even a crumpled piece of paper bearing the poignant words, "I had intended to cease existing, but today I chose to remain." A small testament rendered in ink. Someone placed fresh blossoms nearby. A child left a miniature toy vehicle, murmuring, "Please help my father." A woman lit a candle, her lips sealed in silent contemplation. In a world saturated with noise, they had convened for this. The quietude that mends, the presence that does not impose, the affection that requires no explanation. The local news crew eventually arrived, documenting the scene with cameras and inquiries. However, no lens could capture the true essence of what transpired, for it was not a visual phenomenon, but an emotional resonance. Elmbrook transcended its identity as a mere town. It had become a spiritual gateway, and the humble church, with its protesting pews and chipped plaster, was transformed into consecrated ground, a haven not for definitive answers, but for a return to oneself. A woman in her 70s articulated it most eloquently. "I cannot pinpoint what drew me here, but I now find myself unable to depart." Consequently, they remained, some for an hour, some for a night, and some irrevocably changed. This transformation was not due to the statue's movement or the candle's amplified luminescence, but rather to the awakening of something ancient, something that posed no questions about denominational affiliation or the sufficiency of faith, but simply inquired, "Are you weary?" Then it invited them to rest, stating, "She is waiting." And within that tranquil anticipation, the world began to mend, one heart at a time. No public pronouncements invited testimonials, no elevated platform or amplification equipment was utilized. Nevertheless, individuals began to speak, not for recognition, but because silence had become an impossibility. It commenced with a gentleman in his 50s, seated in the final row. He rose quietly after a weekday service, turned to the few remaining individuals, and stated, "I have not offered a prayer in 27 years. My wife succumbed to cancer. I harbored resentment towards God, but I came here simply to observe. Now I am uncertain of my beliefs. but for the first time, I desired to believe again. Although no one applauded, several nodded in agreement, and some were moved to tears. Subsequently, a teenager from Baton Rouge stepped forward. She chronicled her narrative in a notebook and placed it at the base of the statue. Later, her words were read aloud. I had devised a plan. I possessed the means. My intention was to vanish, but I encountered a video depicting this location, and an inner voice compelled me. Attempt one more Sunday. I came. She was present, and I remained. I am not yet entirely healed, but I am still present. Her written account remained at the altar for weeks, its edges softened by the heat of candles and the touch of reverent hands. Then, a young couple, married for 6 years and no longer communicating at home, sat side by side during a Saturday evening observance. Afterward, the husband lingered near the statue, whispering almost inaudibly, "We were on the verge of finalizing our separation last week, but tonight, seeing her gaze upon my wife, it felt like a poignant reminder. She is still yours, and I still believe in both of you." He reached for his wife's hand. She accepted it, and they departed together, not miraculously healed, but holding on to each other. Others expressed their experiences in subtle ways. A young boy with autism placed a toy train at the statue's base, saying, "This is my favorite. I wish her to have it." An individual previously incarcerated sat for 3 hours, gazing at the flame near the Virgin's feet, then declared aloud, "I had believed I would never again be welcomed in any church. But here, no one inquired about my past actions. They simply regarded me as if I were already absolved." One afternoon, a woman returned for the 3rd time that week, carrying a box containing her father's ashes. She approached the pastor, explaining, "He died consumed by anger, harboring hatred for God and the church. But his final words before passing were, 'Tell her I am sorry.' I did not comprehend his meaning then, but I believe I do now." She left the box near the altar for a single hour before reclaiming it, though her heart remained. Then, a gentleman in a wheelchair was escorted into the sanctuary by his 2 sons, one on each side. His legs had been immobile for years. He did not petition for physical restoration, but for inner tranquility. He touched the base of the statue and wept, not from physical discomfort, but from a profound sense of liberation. Days later, he returned with a walking stick. Though still frail and unsteady, he was walking. "God did not mend my limbs," he stated. "He mended my resolve." Not everyone experienced a tangible miracle, yet each narrative carried an intrinsic power, a subtle connection, a breach in the darkness, a renewed basis for optimism. The church maintained no official records. There were no designated areas for sharing testimonials, yet every flickering candle, every discarded flower, every stranger kneeling in the aisle represented a story. A narrative of the seemingly impossible gently unfolding into reality. The physical structure remained unaltered. The familiar wooden seats continued to creak beneath shifting weights. The ceiling fan above the 3rd aisle still produced its irregular ticking sound. The altar cloth bore the faint wine stain from Easter 3 years prior. Yet, an intangible transformation had occurred. The church had not been renovated. It had been reawakened. And this revitalization stemmed not from sermons or structured programs, but from genuine presences. One morning, a mother arrived, having completed her night shift. She did not take a seat, but stood in the doorway, her hands in her pockets, tears silently tracing paths down her weary cheeks. She whispered, "I do not even comprehend why I am here." Then she sat and remained. For hours, a young boy entered after school, still in his uniform, his backpack slipping from his shoulder. He was unfamiliar with the prayers, unaware even of her name, but he walked directly to the statue and whispered, "Hello." Then he smiled, offered a single wave, and departed. No formal service, no altar call, simply a moment of acknowledgement. Day by day, the church became less a matter of scheduled events and more a vital pulse. Some came to ignite candles, Others sought solace in quiet contemplation. Some arrived and did not sit at all, merely pausing at the doorway, offering a brief glance, a soft nod, and then leaving. Yet they were not the same upon their departure. Even Pastor Carter underwent a transformation. Not a dramatic or sudden change, but evident in the prolonged moments he spent near the altar, in the pauses before speaking, as if allowing the Holy Spirit precedence, in the subtle cracking of his voice when he uttered, "The Lord be with you." For now, he truly felt it. Not like an abrupt shock, but akin to gravity. Not a cacophony, but a gentle gaze. People no longer inquired, "What time is the service?" Instead, they asked, "Is she still present?" And invariably, she was. Even when no candles were lit, when no music played, and when the sanctuary was devoid of people, her presence lingered like a cherished memory, a whispered promise, a gentle breath. One woman, after kneeling for nearly an hour, best articulated the experience. When gently asked if she required anything, she responded, "No, I have already received far more than I came for." She then quietly departed. No programs were officially organized, no informational pamphlets were distributed, yet hearts continued to arrive. Feet continued to tread the paths leading inward. And with each arrival, a subtle shift occurred. The atmosphere seemed softer, the silence more profound, the walls warmer, not from external heat, but from an influx of hope. A journalist once visited with the intention of crafting a narrative. He posed the question to individuals. What transpired here? No one could provide a definitive answer. It's not what occurred, one man eventually clarified. It's what is occurring. This church had not achieved widespread fame. It had become a familiar haven, a place to which people returned not for grand displays, but for genuine embrace, an embrace not of physical arms or spoken words, but of something eternal, and its essence remained inexplicable. All that could be done was to arrive, to sit, to remain, and to depart, carrying something intangible, yet undeniably real. For this church had not been revitalized by clamor, spectacle, or rigid doctrine. It had been revived by her, not her likeness in stone, but her very presence. And presence, when infused with sanctity, needs no amplification. It endures. Pastor James no longer occupied the pulpit as a preacher delivering a sermon. He stood as a witness, not to his own actions, but to the divine work that had been accomplished through him. A subtle transformation was evident in his movements within the sanctuary. No longer hurried or burdened, he walked with a measured pace, like one finally in harmony with grace. He no longer felt compelled to fill every silence with scripture or every service with a rigid structure. He had learned a far more potent lesson, that some of the most sacred moments necessitate no words at all. He began arriving at the church before dawn, driven not by duty but by eager anticipation. He would personally light the candles, replenish the water for the floral arrangements, and place notes of encouragement in the pews where he once sat in isolation. When individuals sought his counsel, his responses rarely involved explicit instructions. Instead, he would sit alongside them, listen attentively, and often that was precisely what they needed. On Thursday evenings, he commenced keeping the church doors open until midnight. There was no set agenda, no public announcements, only a modest sign displayed outside that read, "If you are weary, come and sit. He is here. She is too." And people came, not to see James, but to discover what he had found. He continued to deliver sermons on Sundays, but his homilies became simpler, gentler, more akin to storytelling than formal addresses. "I once believed my role was to safeguard the faith," he confided to a young seminarian. "But now I understand it is to create an open space for it, not to guard the flame, but simply to ensure the doors are wide enough for others to feel its warmth." He no longer dreaded vacant pews, having witnessed the impact of a single illuminated candle in the darkness. His mission had evolved, not to be heard, but to be accessible, not to proselytize, but to embrace. And in that act of embracing, he transcended his role as a pastor. He became a conduit, bridging sorrow and serenity, silence and a tangible presence, the human soul and the comforting embrace of the mother who waits in stillness. And somehow, unintentionally, he had once again become a shepherd. This time, not of a multitude, but of individual hearts. Not everyone managed to reach Elmbrook. Not everyone was able to. Some viewed the circulated images, some heard the recounted stories, some scrolled past videos late at night, their eyes burning from excessive screen exposure and a deficit of hope. Some uttered, "It's likely not real." Others declared, "It is real, but not for me." Yet they paused. Something within the stillness underlying the narratives resonated with them, not with a loud call, but a persistent whisper, like a hand on the shoulder that, though unfelt, was still perceived. There was a woman in Chicago who fixated on an image of the Virgin on her phone for hours, never initiating playback. A university student in Austin who saved a quote from the pastor into a hidden folder labeled, "Do not open." A man in Detroit who had not entered a church in 40 years, but once drove past an unoccupied chapel at midnight, lowered his window and simply listened. They never lit a candle, never knelt, never touched the base of any statue. Yet the invitation reached them nonetheless, and therein lies the message. The miracle was not inherent in the marble floor, nor in the candles, the statue, or even the man who had fallen. The miracle was the poignant reminder that grace does not await perfection, it awaits consent. And you do not need to travel to Kentucky to grant it. You do not need to be fully prepared. You do not need to possess complete belief. You do not even need to understand the reason for your outreach. You simply need to reach. Because in the quiet space between "I am insufficient" and "perhaps I will try one more time," she is already present, waiting. Not with judgment, but with eyes that have already seen everything and chosen to remain. Therefore, if you have been wandering, if you have been passively scrolling, if you have been attempting to suppress the persistent ache long enough to function, let this be the moment you refrain from pushing it away. Ignite a candle, find stillness, utter a word, any word, or remain entirely silent. She has no need for your pronouncements. She desires your presence. And in return, you will perceive hers, even across a digital divide, through layers of doubt, right here, right now. If this account has stirred something within you, however faint, however quiet, something you are inclined to dismiss, do not turn away from it. Persist. Allow it to flourish. Allow it to speak. And if you wish to encounter more narratives like this, tales of grace, of hope, of quiet miracles that continue to move hearts today, subscribe to Touched by Grace. Because some stories do not conclude, they simply await discovery. And perhaps, just perhaps, this one has found you. Touched by Grace. Authentic stories, subtle marvels, one soul at a time.